you by Medical Protection. I'm Dr. Sarah Coop, a senior medical educator in the risk prevention team. During the COVID pandemic, Medical Protection has sought to provide additional support to our members through podcasts, webinars, and articles on relevant topics and challenges that health professionals are facing. One area that we've focused on recently is that of self-care. So recognising how important this really is so that you've got the energy that you need to be effective and compassionate in your work roles, as well as in your life outside of work. So we've produced several webinars with expert speakers on various aspects of wellbeing. You can have a look at the Prism e-learning site and access those events either live or you can view the recordings. The podcast that you're listening to today, it really ties in with this theme of self-care, as you'll hear about shortly. So whether you've been a qualified GP, a dentist, or a consultant for many years or just a few months, I'm hoping that this will provide a valuable opportunity for you to pause and reflect for a moment on what you know now, both about yourself and your career, as well as looking back to when you were a junior member of staff and having some fresh insight into what you've learned along the way. And I wonder, what advice would you now give your newly appointed self if you could go back in time? So I won't give anything more away at this point. I'm just really pleased to be joined by Professor Peter Gillen, who's an Associate Professor of Surgery for the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and Professor Eva Doherty, also an Associate Professor and Director of Human Factors and Patient Safety. So a warm welcome to you both today. So Peter, along with several co-authors, Eva being one of them, you wrote an article entitled 5 Things I Wish I'd Known When I Became a Consultant, which was published online last October. And I know that from our previous conversations that when you had the idea originally, you thought it would just be a little bit of light-hearted discussion, but it really led to significant contributions and in-depth insights, many of which I think will ring true for doctors and dentists working in healthcare currently. So Peter, tell us first something about where this idea came from and then how it developed into the article.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Initially, we had a coffee time chat, nothing more than that. And with the responses that we were getting, I thought, my goodness, this could be quite an amusing study to do. And when we set up the link for people to fill in the survey that I set up, I was amazed to see that they were really quite in-depth analysis coming through. Originally, I thought this might end up in the Christmas edition of the BMJ or something like that. But actually, as soon as I saw the material coming through, then I realized that it really did need to be taken seriously. And that was when we decided to put it through the analysis properly. And what we did was we got almost 2,000 pieces of advice in total. So it was quite a challenge, but we used thematic induction analysis with 3 independent observers to reduce bias, and then statistically looked at all the information to divide all the pieces of advice into 20 different themes. And so it became a much more serious study, Sarah, than we had originally intended, yes.
Yeah, you said it was really clear that people had taken this to heart when they were reflecting on it and obviously writing their replies. And what made you choose 5 things to ask for rather than 1?
Well, I thought 1 might be very limiting, and also that it might tempt people to be quite glib in what they might say. So by asking people to sit down and reflect on 5 things, I was giving them a good bit of latitude and also making them really ponder what they would like to have been told and not to limit it. I also designed a study that we didn't use a drop-down menu for people to select pieces of advice from. And although that might have meant that we lost some people because it's more difficult to write free text analysis, it did mean that we got a more in-depth feeling from people, I felt. And the advice given was really quite considered. So I was very pleased that we went for 5 rather than 1.
And what types of consultants responded and also where were they working?
Yeah, that's interesting. We got a huge variety of different specialties involved. And while the majority were from Ireland and the UK, there were in fact 20 different jurisdictions represented. And it was remarkable that the themes that emerged were in fact quite universal and didn't seem to be affected by whatever healthcare system people were working in. So the same pieces of advice were mirrored right across the globe, actually.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I think to know that it wasn't just one place that you got the results and the replies from, that it was quite widespread. And another thing that you looked at was how long consultants have been in post. What was behind that question in your mind? Did you find anything significant?
Yeah, again, from the outset, my own bias was I thought that older consultants might have a different take to younger consultants, but we needed to analyse those themes statistically. And yes, there were differences, and I think we'll come to those later, perhaps in the podcast, and some of them were very, very interesting.
Yeah, so don't keep us in suspense any longer then. So do tell us, what were the top 5 pieces of advice that you found in your research?
Well, number 1 passed the post, and a clear winner was self-care. Second was work-life balance. The third was relationship with colleagues. The fourth was team working. And the fifth was continuous education.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? And I think just to start that off then, let's think about, or I'll ask you, what do you think that people mean by self-care?
Yeah, so this was the clear winner in the study, if you like. And what people meant by self-care was the most common phrase that I came across was, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so the advice for self-care was very simple about plenty of rest, sleep, exercise, diet, and taking care of one's mental health as well. So I read those far more frequently than any other piece of advice.
Yeah, thank you. And just coming to you now, Eva, self-care also you found was significantly less likely to feature as a reply in those that had more than 20 years in practice. So what thoughts did you have about why there was that difference?
So I think this reflects the differing priorities that different generations have. So, people born in the 40s, 50s and 60s are what we call baby boomers. And it's well recognized that they're good at tightening their belts. They go down with the ship, so to speak. Whereas more recent generations are, better at prioritizing self-care and looking after themselves. That's a priority for them.
Yeah, and I'd be really interested as well to know what you think we can learn from those findings to help us understand about the level of burnout that we're seeing amongst consultants, because obviously this is really related to self-care. What thoughts have you got on that?
Yeah, so the bad news is that, levels of burnout are, equally as high as other more junior colleagues, if not even higher in some aspects. I mean, for example, we know in Ireland, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in the UK, that consultants report, about half the consultants will report reduced levels of what we call self-efficacy. And so that's the sense that that they're not making a difference. And, and I think that's it's sad, it really, isn't it, that they have worked so hard to get to this level and that they're clearly working in a healthcare organization that's not supporting them to make change and improvements and to actually make a difference. And this is one of the well-recognized toxic factors that Christina Maslach and her colleagues have identified through their empirical research. And it's this lack of a sense of control. And there are other toxic factors that can exist in an organization that will trigger burnout. So they will include things like a sense of unfairness, that maybe resources, etc., are not being shared out equally. Another one can be an unreasonable workload, though it's certainly not the most critical, is what Christina Maslach's research has found out. And another toxic factor can have to do with, is there hypocrisy in the organization? Do perhaps, people are not meeting the standards, that they espouse to by their behaviors. And another possible toxic factor is a lack of trust. So the question is, do you feel that other people, that your colleagues have your back and that they'll support you. Maybe if you have something going on in your family, or if you're sick, do you feel like you can phone up a colleague and say, will you cover me for today? And then the last one, and I think, very interesting one, is this sense of lack of recognition and reward. And it doesn't mean money. Organizational psychologists will tell us, that people don't leave their jobs, they leave their bosses. And so that just reflects the desire we have. It's one of Maslow's needs, a hierarchy of needs. We need to be recognized for what we do. We need somebody to say, you really handled that situation really well, or that was an amazing operation, the way you saved that patient, or whatever it might be, or thank you for doing this for me. If we get that kind of recognition, we will put up with a lot. So they're as I say, the toxic factors. And I think, people often talk about burnout as if it's some kind of personal failing, but actually burnout is an indicator of how well or how badly an organization is functioning, and how supportive it is of the individual. If you get burnt out, it's an indicator that there's a poor fit between you and the organization you're working for. It's not an indicator that there's something, wrong with you as such.
Yeah, I think that's been described as a workplace phenomenon, hasn't it? And I think it's helpful to look at those 6 toxic factors to reflect on personally, but also as leaders or team colleagues. I think it's helpful as well to look at and just think, is there anything that that I can do, that we can do, that might help to support each other, to support ourselves, particularly in the current climate. So, Peter, the second highest piece of advice was work-life balance. How might you interpret the findings that you had on this?
Well, work-life balance was, again, as you said, number 2. And it was, I think, a little bit sad to think that older consultants in particular were writing down that they wished they paid more attention to work-life balance in their younger years. As Eva said, people work so hard to get to the top, achieve their goals, get a top job, whether it's a consultant post or dentist, GP, whatever it might be in medicine. We see the same themes running through all these. And then people sometimes just get overwhelmed with the responsibility and bury themselves, as it were, in their work, and feel that success is measured by how well their work career progresses over the next 20 years. And then one day they wake up and realize that they've missed so much outside of work, perhaps significant birthdays or anniversaries or family events. And suddenly it dawns on them that work is work and life goes on outside it. And it was sad to see that people were regretting that they hadn't paid more attention to work-life balance over their career.
Yeah, thank you. And I've heard, we're looking at some research by Shanafelt, who came up with similar factors to Maslow's that you talked about, Eva, the 6 toxic factors, but rather than calling it work-life balance, it was called work-life integration. And I think that's often a helpful way of looking at it, that often there's not a distinct boundary between work and outside work, but more about integration. And I just wondered, Peter, what you thought junior doctors or junior dentists might take away from that insight about work-life integration or balance.
I think it's important that, when they hear this podcast today, that maybe it makes them reflect on what kind of boundaries they're setting themselves from the outset. I think particularly if you begin well and pay attention to self-care and work-life balance, it's a real recipe for success. So I would really hope that people would listen today, and maybe that this would come as a little bit of a check, that people could sort of take a step back and say, well, how am I getting on? How's my work-life balance? And, have I got the balance right now? Because if you don't begin the way you want to, it just tends to slip, and suddenly 20 years have gone by in the blink of an eye. And that's so sad to realize that you just never corrected it in time.
Yeah, so just pausing and stopping and thinking, I think, is really key, isn't it? There's so many pressures on clinicians, both external and internal, at different stages of life, different stages of career progression, that can really add to the challenge. So I think what you said there about the importance of boundaries, the importance of needing to pace and set limits, and also recognizing what you can control, what's within your control, what's within your influence, and not expending a lot of energy on things that are perhaps outside of that, but also just to bring it back to what you can do, and as a team what we can do that can be really helpful. So Eva, I don't know what your thoughts are. Any practical tips for those who are really struggling to do this? As we said, particularly at the moment during COVID, when workload is understandably higher and the ability to recharge outside of work might be even more difficult to do. What sort of thoughts have you got?
So the point about awareness has already been made, and I think that is the necessary first step. And then after that, I think it's about thinking about the known ingredients for work-life balance, and if you like, doing a little self-assessment and sort of seeing, how do I score on these? I mean, minding your relationships is key, and that is obviously what can get neglected in terms of work-life balance. So it's about making sure that you attend to your relationships with your family, your partner, your friends. They're a really good source of stress relief. And then it's all the other good things like sleep hygiene and exercising and maintaining a healthy diet, taking time out for some relaxation and mindfulness. And I usually find when I have these conversations with clinicians that about half of them are, doing okay on in terms of their work-life balance. They're managing, to do these things, and the other half aren't. And it's often because they just really haven't thought about it, or because they assume that because they're so busy that they just don't have time. But when they see their peers managing, these aspects of work-life balance, that can really get them thinking. And it is about being creative. Where can I get the exercise in? Maybe I could cycle to work. How could I attend to my relationships? Maybe I need to organize, a date night with my partner. It's about being creative, I think, and because it's definitely challenging, there's no doubt.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think it comes back to recognising the priorities and then looking to see where you have choice and thinking, what are my choices in this situation? And I think your point there about really maximising and really investing in supportive relationships is so key in order to balance that, as well as identifying what things perhaps energise you as well as what drains you. And again, getting that balance there. So hopefully those are helpful things for people to think about. And then coming back to you, Peter, relationships with colleagues was third on the list. So what sort of things did people mention in their replies relating to this theme?
Yeah, so this varied quite a bit. In general, some people felt that this was really key to a good work relationship, that if people put a lot of time and energy into getting on with colleagues, that it would benefit in the long run. Others had a more practical aspect to say. It was a little bit like being born into a family, that you didn't get a choice. But there were comments from younger consultants who would visit units and feel that if colleagues were perhaps, perceived to be less than welcoming, then there was an indication that people wouldn't take a post like that. We do know that if you find yourself among colleagues who are dysfunctional, then that does have an evidence-proved basis for an adverse patient outcome. And I think it's also very difficult personally when you find yourself in a situation like that. So I think that definitely working with colleagues, perhaps thinking about maybe once a month having a meal or something outside of work to promote a social aspect to work as well was very often advised. And I would concur with that.
Yeah, and medical protection, because of the associated risks with poorer patient outcomes and that suboptimal patient care, because we know that dysfunctional interactions with colleagues and those toxic work environments and persistent conflict can really link in with those things, as you've said. As well as being highly stressful for the individuals themselves, we're really keen to look at ways of supporting and addressing that. So we have various courses on helping people to improve their relationships with colleagues when it's difficult. But even what else could people do to reduce that risk?
So, as Peter says, I think it's about appreciating each other as individuals, all with a common goal, which is patient care. And sometimes I think, that people can not make that explicit. And once you start to make that explicit, that can help towards negotiating. But I think also, the silos that we have in healthcare is a feature whereby people feel very different to each other and, lose sight of the fact that we're all after the one thing. It's really about, taking a step back and asking yourself the question, why are they being like this? What could be their perspective? Where are they coming from? And there are skills that you can use as well to help to reflect that and to demonstrate that you do appreciate the other person's point of view and you do see where they're coming from, and how can this be resolved. But I've always been interested when I run training on this, that people are really struck about how devoted and compassionate everybody is, even though that may not come across in some of their interactions. But it really is about appreciating people as individuals, with valid perspectives.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. I think that really ties in with a lot of the key messages that medical protection and risk prevention we try to get across in when we're talking about difficult interactions with colleagues or difficult interactions with patients. It's about trying to find where's the common ground. Also avoiding making assumptions. It's so easy, isn't it, to assume what the other person's motivation is, and that often isn't correct. And I think instead trying to think, as you've said, what might they be thinking? What might be behind their behaviour? Can we shift our own mindset? Can we keep an open mind in order to find a solution here that could actually work for everybody? And I think that does take a little bit, again, of stopping and thinking and challenging our own thinking to do that and recognising, what might be going on. So following on from that a little bit, female consultants in your survey listed the ability to say no significantly more than male consultants did. So what might be some of the reasons for that, Eva, do you think?
Well, I'm wondering whether that reflects perhaps a number of things. It's definitely true that, even in the 21st century, the responsibility for the family management, if you like, in terms of childcare and, other domestic responsibilities, often does still fall to the female. And maybe there's a tension sometimes between, being asked to do extra things and what has to be managed at home also. But I wonder too, does it reflect the fact that maybe we don't make it easy for female consultants to say no, and that healthcare has all these expectations for consultants that they have to be all things to all people, and that maybe it's easier for male consultants to kind of step in there, as we've been saying, and to the detriment of their work-life balance and their self-care. But for women, it's harder for them to do that because, they might have children to collect or look after, etc. So, I wonder whether, do we support women saying no in our society? I don't know. I think we might, we could be guilty of some gender bias there, whereas it's easier for men to say no than it is for women to say no.
Thanks. Those are interesting thoughts. And I think some of that links in with what we talked about earlier about setting boundaries and often the importance of being able to say no in order to have that healthier work-life balance. But perhaps it's that some people have never really learned how to do that. And so are there any strategies that you might suggest that can really increase our ability to say no effectively and respectfully so that people do listen to it and actually that it's safe to say no? So I suppose we're thinking about appropriate assertiveness here, I think.
Yeah, and the skills will overlap with, successful negotiations as well. They're very similar. But I think probably the most effective tip I can offer is try and start your sentences with the word I. I think, I feel, I'm not comfortable. I need to get back to you, maybe, could be another one. Just give yourself a bit of time to think about it. I'm not sure I can, meet that deadline. Whatever it is you're going to say it with the word I at the beginning, and you're much more likely to come across as assertive.
Yeah, I agree. Those I statements is all about you taking responsibility for your decision rather than a you statement, which can often sound quite accusatory or labeling. So a you statement would be something like, you're so demanding, asking me to do that extra shift. Whereas an I statement is very much about taking that ownership. And I think that's really important as well. And I think the other tip that I've often found helpful and talked about on training is think about if you're saying no to something, it's because you're saying yes to something else. So often that's quite helpful internally to think, actually, I'm going to say no to that because I want to say yes to something, and getting that sense of choice and balance as well around that. So Peter, coming on to the final bits here, talking about improved communication with patients, this was the 6th top piece of advice that people gave. And I know, again, this is something that we associate with increased medical legal risk. So it's another important area to focus on. And from your involvement in communication skills training with the National Healthcare Communication Programme that I know you are involved with, which 1 or 2 communication skills would you say are really key in terms of making a positive difference in interacting with patients?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that, Sarah. And again, I was delighted to see it come up so high on the list of priorities here. I think if I had to choose 1 or 2 of all the communication skills, I think active listening and demonstration of empathy would be my top 2. I think increasingly we're seeing more and more technology, more and more computerized interactions with patients, and the ability perhaps to listen to people, actively listen to people, is suffering, I think, because of that. And certainly patients are saying that if they don't feel listened to, then that's a slippery slope for them, and complaints and so on can easily follow. Empathy, I think, is huge. I know I've heard Eva say this many times before, that when we've got nothing else to give patients, we certainly have empathy. And so I would really counsel people to learn the skills of demonstrating empathy, because, again, that's something that if we can demonstrate empathy, patients will really feel that we've made them special. And I think that that's an important point in any consultation with a patient.
Yeah, I really agree that active listening and empathy are 2 skills that are so important. And we often think that we're very good at listening. We think we're very good at empathizing. And yeah, it's a chance sometimes to stop and think, actually, how well am I listening? How well am I empathizing? We can all learn to do that even better. And those are 2 key skills as well that really communicate compassion to people. It's often an intention of ours, but it might not come across in the way that we want it to. So yeah, just encourage you to think about that a little bit more. Eva, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the skills or the drills, if you like, you can make yourself do, which will definitely make you a better listener, is to repeat back to the patient or the family member what you've just heard them say. And that will make you listen, and it'll also, reassure the person that they're being listened to. And I think in terms of demonstrating empathy, it's not about saying, I understand what you're going through. It's about saying, I can see you're really upset, and I can see, that you're very frustrated. So it's about actually saying what you can see, or if you're on the phone, saying what you can hear, and the emotion, actually naming the emotion. It's often called naming the elephant in the room. You actually say the emotion that you can see that the person is expressing.
Yeah, thank you. So being more specific in your summarising back and your recapping, that's what often reaches out to the patient and really lands well with them and helps them to feel that you have understood. So rather than saying, yes, I understand, which we may not, but it's about showing that you have heard them. And that's what people are wanting. So finally, Peter, some of the replies that you received from the survey weren't really advice to their younger selves as such. They were more comments or anecdotes. And just out of those, I'm just interested to know, was there any that struck you or made you smile in particular?
There were certainly some of them probably not repeatable on a podcast, sadly, Sarah. But certainly one of my favourites was "There's nothing at the top of the greasy pole," and that certainly made me smile. So, but there were lots of very humorous comments as well. But overall, I think people took the survey really seriously, and it was a pleasure reading all the comments. Some of them very tough to read, but overall, it was a really tough read at times, but very well worth it.
Yeah, thank you. And just out of interest, do you think that if people were to read this as their younger self, do you think they would have heeded it?
Well, I suppose that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? Maybe I'll leave the last word to Oscar Wilde, because he was the one that said the only thing to do with good advice is to pass it on. It's never of any use to oneself. And maybe we should think about that.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you both, Peter and Eva, for a really fascinating discussion. So do look up the article. You can find it on the internet under 5 things that I wish I'd known when I became a consultant. And maybe this could be a good conversation starter for you at your next team meeting or a CME peer group. You might be surprised by some of the answers that you hear from different people. It will give you some insight into what's going on for them, what they think about, and it perhaps wouldn't always be what you might have guessed. So thanks again for downloading the podcast, and remember that there are wellbeing resources on our website. And as a medical protection member, you're entitled to access free counselling if you wish to use that benefit. So thank you very much and goodbye.